Here is a concluding unscientific postscript to our Wheels of Justice journey, our stories from the deep north. I think there are many lessons to be drawn from the journey through the deep north that we've undertaken together, a journey that I imagine will continue from time to time as we move forward. One consequence of this journey is the knowledge that the early history of New England is incomprehensible if that history is told merely from the perspective of the Pilgrims and the Puritans and other European emigres. Those histories fail to absorb the enormity of what occurred among the native populations that already resided here, and the waves of pain and trauma that were unleashed as a result of those Puritan arrivals. As Michael Kickingbear reminded us, that pain still resonates even now, some 400 years later. But you see, those histories also fail to absorb another crucial feature of early New England. Not only was there a powerful native presence here, there was a powerful African presence as well. The Africans who arrived here would likely have come from three major regions of the continent: Senegambia, what is now Sierra Leone, Gambia, Mali, and other places on the upper western coast of the continent. That's where those ships arriving in New London Harbor that we encountered several weeks ago were arriving from. Then traveling a little further south along the coast, others would have come from Guinea, or what is now Ghana and the Ivory Coast and Togo. That's where Venture Smith was captured. That's where he came from. Others within that region may have come from what's now Nigeria and Benin. Finally, still others came from a little bit further south along the continent, from Congo and Angola, what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo and the nation of Angola. That's where Quash Gomer was kidnapped and thereafter brought to live and work in Wethersfield. That means that all along there has been a significant African presence in Connecticut, but also throughout New England. It means that an African culture would have taken shape right here, one that was likely all but invisible to the Puritans and to their descendants, those who built these towns that we reside in. Enslaved peoples here in New England were separated in ways they weren't throughout the South. And so here in New England, we don't have a strong tradition of Black music or dance or visual art analogous to what emerged in other parts of the country. Even so, we can be sure, we can be confident that pieces of Africa were retained here in New England in hushed and fragmentary ways. If that's true of New England as a whole, then it must also be true of Old Lyme. For me, the most significant revelation of this journey has been the realization that that African presence would have existed right here in our town, in Old Lyme. We have records of at least 160 enslaved people in Lyme and Old Lyme alone. What sort of African retentions would they have had? What songs might have been passed down from parents to children or shared across families? What sacred practices might have survived across the Middle Passages, across the generations, to be found right here in Old Lyme and all across the deep north? Those are questions that scholars and researchers are only now beginning to explore, but it is certain that those African retentions and survivals existed here all around us in Old Lyme. Here's what else is certain. To the Puritans and their descendants, those retentions would likely have presented themselves as witchcraft, as superstition, as devil worship. And they would have worked to banish, which is to say, to whitewash those practices from out of the lives of the enslaved, but also from out of the spaces around us. Banishment and whitewashing aside, even so, we can be certain that those African traces were here, every bit as much as the descendants of those who were first kidnapped from Africa were here. Unfortunately, today, a lot of people, especially, I'm ashamed to say, white Protestants, continue to have a similar response when they encounter indigenous or African religious practices today. Those religions are often labeled cults, even in venerable publications such as the New York Times, which ought to know better. And adherents of those religions and those practices are said to traffic in the occult. I hope I don't need to tell you that such a response lacks intellectual sophistication. And it lacks comprehension of the religious dynamics that have been in our midst all around us for centuries in America. It is a tragic reminder of the racist and colonial history that continues to beset us. It's reinforced everywhere in popular culture, where rituals born of Africa become the stuff of horror films. It's tacitly reinforced in our seminaries and our divinity schools, many of which don't see fit to expose students to African religious practices. They want to keep their folks right in the middle in Christianity or Judaism or Islam or something like that. And then it's reinforced even further by evangelical missionaries from the United States who send well-meaning but ignorant people to places throughout Africa and the African diaspora to help to rid residents of their African spiritual retentions. It's also reinforced by predominantly white mainline denominations like the UCC, like the Presbyterians, like the Episcopalians, like the Methodists, who have spent very little time engaging with, let alone trying to understand and thereafter to fall in love with any of those African practices. I believe it's time to change all of that. And so as a little bonus, here's where I want to take us to one more site on our Wheels of Justice journey. A year ago, just before the pandemic hit, just before it brought the world to a halt, I found myself in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, sitting on the porch of the splendid Hotel Olofsen, a place you'll now see a little bit from as I speak. It's a place with a long association with the practice of voodoo, one of Haiti's most significant contributions to world culture. It is Africa reblended. As I sat at the Olofsen that day, a few hours in the future, I would take part in a long 24-hour voodoo ritual. But in that moment, Sitting at the Olafsen, I was in conversation with a man named Richard Morse, the proprietor of the Hotel Olafsen, and the leader of the band Ram, who we heard from several weeks ago. Richard has a very interesting story. He was raised in New Haven here in Connecticut. His father was a professor at Yale. And he grew up going to a Congregationalist church, he said. But Richard's mother is Haitian, a practitioner of Vodou. And after college, Richard moved to Haiti and began to engage his mother's culture more fully. He himself wound up becoming an initiate in Vodou, and he calls what he now does Puritan Vodou. Puritan Vodou. It's a nod to that part of himself that was formed in Congregationalist churches. That's a real part. As well as that aspect of him that was formed by engaging his mother's religion, which was born of Africa. It is a synthesis that I deeply admire. One that progressive religious folk might do well to emulate. Sitting on the porch of the Olafsen, Richard Morse said to me, "You know, you've got 500 years of a wall, a 500-year-old wall within you." He went on, Protestantism, especially the Congregationalist variety, is minimalist religion, he told me. It's religion that is reluctant about images. It's reluctant about visual symbols. It's reluctant about rituals. It's reluctant about the movement of one's body. It's reluctant about spirit. It's a religious expression devoted to words, and so it winds up operating up here in the head. It's a religion that gets translated out into the world as social ethics. African religions are a little bit different. Vodou, Richard told me, is maximalist religion. There's an amplitude of rituals, an amplitude of symbols, an amplitude of visuality, an amplitude of movement of everything. But here's what he said to me. He said, what you're working with in mainline Protestantism is 500 years worth of trying to keep that maximalism out. Well, I wondered, is there a way to tunnel under that wall? Or is there a way to scale over the wall to go over it? Richard Morse's response to me was telling. I don't think so, he said. I don't think you can go under it. I don't think you can go over it. Instead, he said, it's maybe something more like that wall in the Harry Potter movies. You have to run right into the wall and go through it if you want to get to the other side. It turns out that Morse was describing a conflict that exists right in the pages of the Bible itself. Because there is an element of expressive, maximalist religion within the pages of the Bible, but it always sits very uneasily alongside that minimalist, word-centered, intellect-oriented understanding of religion. And that conflict can best be seen in that story of King David that we heard earlier, where David abandons whatever inhibitions he has and dances with abandon, in a manner that likely bears more in common with African traditions than it would with, say, the liturgical dancing that I've witnessed from time to time in church settings. That expressive display is the occasion for scandal for at least one observer who tells the king that he has disgraced himself by his abandon. King David is unmoved by that criticism. I believe that story as a whole encapsulates this tension that often exists between minimalist and maximalist expressions of religion throughout our tradition. That same tension travels into the New Testament as well, where spirit-filled eruptions take place and then are either suppressed or domesticated elsewhere. It's likely, for instance, that early expressions of the Eucharist, communion, were spirit-filled affairs where participants would evince what to our eyes would look like spirit possession. Not only that, Jesus seemed entirely comfortable in that ecstatic, expressive world. And the synoptic gospels in particular suggest that Jesus himself operated as a kind of shamanic figure. That is to say, Jesus operated in a way that bears more than a casual resemblance to African traditions. So there is, in other words, strong and compelling biblical ground to help us both to understand this historic tension that Richard Morse was describing for me, but then also to help us move through it, freeing us to embrace the African traditions that our forebears feared and thereafter worked to eradicate. Following that conversation at the Olafson, I took part in a voodoo ritual lasting for some 24 hours, and it was transformative for me in ways I don't have time to elaborate upon just now. But if I were to design a seminary or a divinity school curriculum that was responsive to the racial upheavals that we have experienced this past year and long before that too, in addition to all the work that needs to go into thinking about the history of race in America, and in addition to thinking about all the ways in which social justice practices need to be employed or deployed, I would require students identifying as Christian or as Jewish or as Muslim to study an African or an indigenous religious practice and then to actually participate fully within that tradition. I would go further. I would require aspiring ministers to adopt a kind of shadow religious practice in addition to their dominant tradition, a requirement that would be not unlike having to learn a second or a third or a fourth language. So too, I would encourage congregations with our 500-year-old walls to begin exploring the music and the rituals and the aesthetics of those African practices. I would find ways to invite individuals within congregations like this one, to have some exposure to those traditions. I would start to explore what that wall actually is and to start dismantling it brick by brick by brick, even while learning what it means to walk through walls. In sum, I would seek to resurrect what was already present here in the deep north, what was already among us here in the deep north, even if it was suppressed and shunned. And so, in addition to the ethical commitments entailed by our journey through the deep north, I would insist upon a religious and a spiritual commitment as well, which is to say, inviting African traditions back into our midst. For we too have held them at bay for too long. In essence, I would have us explore our own version of what Richard Morse calls Puritan Vodou, right here in the deep North. That's the seed that I wish to sow on this journey through the deep North. That's why I am so pleased that Isa is here with us today. These are sounds, traditions, rituals that worshiping communities need to become better acquainted with if we are to learn to pass through walls. I solemnly pledge that this will not be the last time we hear these sounds in our meeting house. But it's also a seed that I hope we all continue to nurture and grow as we move past the painful legacy of the Deep North. I'm imagining all kinds of ways that we can nurture this seed. When the pandemic is over, I imagine field trips to New York from time to time to hear and to witness some of the greatest music ever to emerge from those African traditions. And I imagine time spent with the artists themselves, allowing them to explain, to connect what they do with a spiritual vision. I imagine a visit to the Olofsen in Haiti, working in tandem with a visit to the Crosby Center for Haitian Education. The Olofsen is sacred ground if ever there was such. It's there that we could hear Ram and we could speak to Richard Morse about his understanding of Puritan Vodou. I imagine visiting artists and thinkers coming to Old Lyme to share their wisdom and their knowledge. And I imagine excursions to other places as well, like, New Orleans, which can help us detect the sacred strains, the spiritual vibrations that flow from Africa even to this place here in the deep North. Yes, we must seek to overcome the legacy of suffering and sorrow and pain and trauma that continues to haunt us, yes. But we must learn to dance and to celebrate if we are to learn how to move through walls. Isa's going to close us out today in just a few minutes, but before he does, I want you to hear this song from Mavis Staples, accompanied by some of the images from the sites that we have visited over the past 7 weeks. The song is named after the story that Jesus told. Sow good seeds. Sowing good seeds is a fitting conclusion to all that we've come through together. Sow good seeds, everybody.
Sow good seeds, everybody. Sow good seeds, everybody. On the mountain, down in the valley. You're gonna reap just what you sow. Sow by walking, sow by talking, sow by everything you do. Don't mind no one, keep on sowing. You're gonna reap just what you sow. Sow good seeds, everybody. Sow good seeds, everybody. On the mountain, down in the valley. You're gonna reap just what you sow. Hark the voice of Jesus calling, who will come and wake the dead. Tunes of mercy, harvest waiting. Here am I, oh Lord, send me. They'll talk about you. They'll vilify you. Call you everything except the child of God. They don't pay them no mind what they're saying. They're gonna read just what they sow. Sow good seeds. Sow good seeds. Everybody. Sow good seeds. Everybody. On the mountain. In the valley. You're gonna reap just what you sow. Sow good seeds. Sow good seeds. Everybody. Sow good seeds.